Welcome back, dear listeners. I hope this evening finds you comfortably relaxed, your thoughts settled, and your mind ready to wander through the gentle fog of time, wherever you are right now. Perhaps wrapped in a warm blanket, sipping coffee, or simply closing your eyes with the weight of the day behind you. Know that you are most welcome here. Tonight, we drift far away from noise, screens, and speed. We enter the quiet, forgotten corners of ancient history, where the wind was colder, the nights longer, and life far more fragile. Before we step into the mud and silence of the past, I'd love to know, where are you joining from this evening? Are you listening from a quiet city window, a countryside room, a rainy corner of the world? Wherever you are, I am honored to share this moment with you. If you enjoy slow, forgotten stories of the ancient and the ordinary, where history is more about the people who suffered than the ones who ruled, I gently invite you to subscribe to our channel. This way, you'll never miss an episode when we open the gates of the past again. Now, let your body rest, let your mind drift in the long shadow of medieval castles, amid the rolling hills and muddy paths of Europe. Lived the peasant, a person defined not by name or deed, but by place. That place was the bottom, below the knights, the clerics, the merchants, and even the reeves who collected the grain and counted the eggs. The peasant was not a citizen, nor a servant, nor a slave, but neither were they free. They existed within the feudal framework, bound to land they did not own, and to labor they could not refuse. From the outside, their lives appeared dull, slow, repetitive, barely distinguishable from one season to the next. And from the inside, they were much the same. A peasant's world was small, a few square miles at most, a village of thatched roofs, chickens, and the ever-present churn of survival. There was no rise to greatness, no road to wealth, no chance of advancement. A child born into this life would, with nearly perfect certainty, live and die in the same village, in the same class, doing the same work as their parents had done. They did not choose this existence. It was inherited like a surname or a pot. The word peasant itself is a modern simplification. In reality, there were degrees of poverty. Villains, cotters, boarders, serfs, each at slightly different rights, responsibilities, and levels of bondage, but all shared one trait. They worked for someone else, and they did so in exchange for the bare minimum required to live. The land was not theirs. The tools were often not theirs. Even the time they spent each day, from sunrise to sunset, was, in effect, borrowed. Life for the peasant was not about fulfillment or ambition. It was about subsistence. The goal was not happiness. The goal was enough. Enough to eat. Enough to not freeze. Enough to keep from being punished. Their homes were basic. We will return to this later. And so were their routines. Wake, work, eat what little could be spared, and sleep in the same clothes worn that day. A peasant might live decades without owning a mirror, seeing a written word, or touching anything made beyond the village limits. Coins passed through their hands rarely. When they did, they were quickly surrendered to the miller, the priest, the reeve, or the tavern. Most trade was in kind. A peasant who grew onions might barter for a chicken egg. A woman who wove rough cloth might exchange a tunic for grain. There was no marketplace in the modern sense, only seasonal fairs and irregular stalls. Even those were mostly for the wealthy. Time passed slowly for the peasant, not by hours or minutes, but by seasons. There was a planting season, the growing season, the harvest, and the long, cold wait for spring. Days were long in the summer, impossibly short in winter. They rose with the sun and rested with the dark. There were no clocks in their cottages, only church bells in the distance, if the village had a church. The peasant's calendar was built around feast days, saints' days, and the whims of the weather. Each month brought the same labor as the year before, and the year before that. There were no vacations, no days off. Even Sundays, technically a day of rest, required attending mass and performing domestic tasks. To be a peasant was to be overlooked. History books rarely named them. Artists rarely painted them. Scribes rarely wrote about them. And when they did, it was as a warning or an example of lowliness. Peasants were the backdrop of medieval life. They tilled the fields, gathered the hay, raised the livestock, and vanished into a fog of time. Their stories were not recorded because they were not seen as important. And yet, they were the majority. More than 80% of Europe's population in the Middle Ages consisted of peasants. They were the ones who grew the wheat, built the roads, paid the taxes, and filled the bellies of those in power. Without them, there would have been no kings, no castles, no crusades. Still, they remained voiceless. They had few rights. In many regions, they could not leave the manor without permission. Their marriages had to be approved. Their livestock could be seized in times of hardship. If they broke a tool, they had to repair it. If they lost a harvest, they still owed grain. If they fell ill, they still had to work. The system was designed not for their benefit, but to extract from them. And yet they endured. They formed communities. They raised children. They maintained customs and traditions. Their songs were simple, their festivals rare, their stories passed down by word of mouth. There was joy, though small, a good harvest, a healthy child, a shared loaf of bread on a cold day. To the modern mind, their existence may seem bleak, and it was in many ways, but it was also stable. The world changed slowly. Wars came and went, but the peasant remained. Kings rose and fell, but the village stayed much the same. It was not a life of riches, nor of rights. It was a life of repetition. And in that repetition, a kind of rhythm, a predictable, if difficult, cadence that defined medieval Europe for centuries. This is their story, or rather, the shape of their story. It has no protagonist, no climax, no surprise ending. It is a quiet thread that runs beneath the louder tales of knights and nobles. It begins, as it always does, in a small cottage of wattle and daub, with smoke rising faintly from a hearth, and a rooster crowing the pale blue light of another long day. The typical home of a medieval peasant did not resemble what modern minds might picture when they think of the word house. There were no bricks, no stone chimneys, no wooden floors. Instead, these homes were assembled from the materials that nature provided, or rather, what nature allowed peasants to collect. In most cases, that meant mud, straw, sticks, dung, and patience. These were not permanent homes. They were not designed for beauty or comfort. They were constructed out of necessity and maintained by repetition. To live in one was not a matter of pride or choice. It was simply what was available. The construction technique most commonly used was called wattle and daub. The process was labor-intensive but required no expensive materials. First, a simple wooden frame was built, usually from whatever timber was accessible. Then, thin branches or sticks were woven horizontally between the vertical supports, forming the wattle. After that came the daub, a thick mixture of clay, animal dung, straw, and soil pressed into the woven frame until the gaps were filled. When dried, the walls became surprisingly strong, though not particularly weatherproof. In heavy rain, they could begin to crumble. In long winters, they let in the cold. But for a peasant, it was enough. Not because it was good, but because there was no alternative. The roof was thatched, layers of straw piled high and tied tightly to wooden beams. When freshly applied, thatch repelled water and insulated heat. But straw is not eternal. Over time, birds nested in it. Wind blew it loose. Rain softened and rotted it. And since hiring someone to replace it was costly, many roofs simply stayed damaged, patched in places, leaking in others. A common household smell was damp straw mixed with smoke, rising from the center of the room where the hearth sat. The hearth was central, not just physically, but socially and practically. It provided heat, light, and a place to cook. But most peasant homes did not have chimneys. Smoke rose through a hole in the thatch, or simply collected inside until it drifted out through cracks. This meant that the interior of the home was often smoky, especially in winter. The ceiling would blacken, eyes would sting, coughing was common. The smoke, though unpleasant, also served a purpose. It helped preserve food, repelled insects, and dried the daub walls. Still, it made the air heavy, especially in the evenings when families gathered around the fire. The layout of the house was simple. Often just one room, sometimes two, if the family was particularly fortunate. There was no hallway, no bedroom. The entire family slept in the same space. Parents, children, infants, and sometimes even grandparents all shared the same straw bedding, laid on a hard-packed earth floor. The straw was replaced infrequently, and after enough time, it took on the smell of mold, animals, and bodies. If livestock were kept, chickens, a goat, or perhaps a pig, they might also share the living space, especially in colder months. Animals produced heat, and manure, though smelly, could be scooped up in the morning and added to the fields. Windows were small, if they existed at all. Glass was too expensive, even in its roughest form. Instead, windows were simply holes cut into the wall and covered with wooden shutters. During the day, these could be opened to let in light. During storms, they were kept tightly closed. As a result, most peasant homes were dim, even during daylight hours. Candles were rare, typically made from tallow, a kind of animal fat that burned with strong, unpleasant odor. A candle might be used at night if absolutely necessary, but more often, peasants relied on a hearth for all their light. Furniture was minimal. A bench or two, a simple table, maybe a stool. Beds were rare. Straw mattresses laid on the ground or raised slightly on a wooden frame. Clothes were stored in bundles. Tools hung from pegs, and anything breakable was tucked carefully into corners. There were no wardrobes, no cupboards. Most possessions could fit into a single chest, if the family was lucky enough to own one. Walls might be decorated, but not in the way we imagine. Occasionally, herbs were hung to dry, or religious symbols were etched crudely into the daub. Some families kept a small wooden cross above the hearth, or a rough image of a saint painted on a board. These were not luxuries, but gestures of belief, decorative in form, but devotional in purpose. Hygiene was difficult. There was no running water, no latrines inside the house. Water had to be fetched daily, from a stream, a well, or a communal barrel. Waste was taken outside in buckets, or disposed of in nearby ditches. Bathing was rare, typically done in rivers during warmer months, or not at all during winter. Soap existed, but it was coarse and expensive. Most peasants washed only their hands and faces regularly, and even then, only with cold water. Insects were a constant nuisance. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs thrived in the straw bedding and on the wooden floors. There were no remedies, only habits. Combing hair with bone combs, rubbing clothing with herbs, shaking out blankets. Still, infestations were common. Scratching was normal. It was part of life, like the smoke or the smell of dung. And yet, for all its discomfort, the peasant home was still a place of gathering. It was where meals were eaten, stories were told, songs were sung softly before bed. It was a shelter from rain and snow, a space where children were born, where bread was baked, and where generations might live out their days. It was not ideal, it was not healthy, but it was, in the end, home. Visitors were rare. Most peasants stayed close to their village. The idea of hosting a guest, of offering wine, or showing off furnishings was foreign. A neighbor might stop by, a priest might pass through, but for the most part, these homes were private in the most literal sense, unseen by the outside world. There are few records of their interiors, few drawings, few written descriptions. What we know comes from archaeology, from tax records, and from rare glimpses in manorial surveys. And so, the peasant's house, built from the land, warmed by the weather, warmed by a smoky fire, was not a place of comfort. It was a place of endurance. A thin wall between the body and the cold. A low roof under which the ordinary business of survival carried on, day after day, season after season, century after century. If one were to describe the medieval peasant's diet in a single word, it would be monotonous, not in the poetic sense, not the humble repetition of wholesome rustic meals, but in the exacting literal sense. Food that repeated itself, meal after meal, day after day, year after year. There was no variety, no indulgence, and little satisfaction. Eating was not a source of delight or creativity. It was a matter of fuel, something done to preserve strength for the next round of work, and nothing more. The base of most meals was grain, specifically bread, but this bread was not soft or golden. It was dense, dark, and coarse, often made from rye, barley, or oats, depending on the region and what the land would tolerate. Wheat was rare, expensive, reserved for the wealthy or the religious institutions. Peasants rarely tasted it. Instead, they relied on mixed flours, grains milled on communal stones that left behind flecks of grit. As a result, peasant bread could be harsh on the teeth. It was heavy, unevenly baked, and occasionally sour, especially when leavened with leftover dough instead of proper yeast. Bread was eaten with nearly every meal and often as the meal. In the morning, it might be dipped in ale or water. At midday, it could be crumbled into a thin vegetable broth. In the evening, it was served again, now hardened, perhaps toasted near the fire. Fresh loaves were a rarity. Most bread was baked weekly and consumed slowly over several days, growing staler, drier, tougher with time. When not eating bread, the peasant ate pottage, a kind of thick stew or porridge made by boiling grains with whatever vegetables were on hand. The base might be barley or oats. Into it, they added chopped onions, leeks, garlic, cabbage, or root vegetables like parsnips and turnips. Carrots were available in some areas, though the orange variety familiar today did not exist. Seasoning was minimal. Salt was expensive. Herbs grew in cottage gardens, sage, thyme, parsley, but were used sparingly. The result was a thin, earthy mixture. Sometimes soupy, sometimes sticky, always bland. Meat was not part of the daily diet. Not for the peasant. Chickens were kept for eggs, not for slaughter. Pigs, if raised, were salted and preserved for the cold months, if not claimed first by the Lord as part of feudal dues. A peasant might eat a piece of bacon on a holy day. He might taste goose at Christmas, if fortunate. More often, meat was replaced by beans, peas, or lentils, dried and soaked to form a thick paste. In truth, the protein came not from animals, but from plants, and from the occasional bone used to flavor the stew, long after the meat was gone. Dairy existed, but in small quantities. A cow's milk was for the calf first. What remained might be churned into a coarse butter, or left curdle and become a crumbly cheese. Cheese was not smooth or rich. It was dry, sharp, a way of preserving nutrition, not pleasure. Sometimes milk was added to pottage to thicken it. Most often, it was consumed immediately, before it soured in the warmth of the home. The peasant drank ale, weak and cloudy, brewed at home or in small batches. It was not strong. Children drank it. It was safer than water, which might be drawn from a stream fouled by animals or waste. The ale had to be brewed often. It did not last long. It was warm, slightly sour, and essential. There was also cider in regions where apples grew, and sometimes mead if honey could be acquired, a rare luxury. Fruits were seasonal and infrequent. Apples, pears, or berries might be gathered in summer. Preserved in jars, if jars were available. But sugar was unheard of. Sweetness came from honey, if it came at all. Vegetables were more common, grown in garden plots behind the home, or gathered wild. Nettles, sorrel, and dandelion greens were boiled down into soups. Mushrooms, cautiously picked, might appear in a stew. But the knowledge of what was edible and what was deadly was passed down carefully. Mistakes were rare and deadly. There were no forks, only knives and spoons. Meals were eaten from shared bowls, using fingers or pieces of stale bread used as scoops. The table, if there was one, was wooden, rough. Meals were quick. There was no ceremony. Grace was said. Food was consumed. Dishes were minimal. There were no courses, no desserts. A feast might include pie, made with meat and thick crusts. But peasants rarely saw pie. It was more likely they ate leftovers from a manor, if permitted, in times of famine. And famine was not uncommon. The diet became desperate. Peasants stretched their rations with acorns or bark or spoiled grain. They dug into winter stores, thinned the pottage, made bread from chestnut flour. When that failed, they waited. There was little choice. The hungry months between planting and harvest were known and feared. Even in good years, the belly was rarely full. Fullness was for nobles, monks, and God. Malnutrition was common. Children grew slowly. Teeth were worn down by grit. Bodies aged early. Illness found its way in through weakness. In art from the period, peasants are depicted as lean, hunched, often barefoot. Their clothing hangs loosely. Their eyes are sunken, and the bowls before them are plain. Food was not a reward, not a joy. It was a chore like the rest of life. Something to prepare, consume, and endure. And when the last crust was eaten and the fire banked for the night, the peasant lay down, not full, but no longer hungry. And that was enough. When the sun began to rise, not fully, but just enough to reveal the gray outlines of thatched rooftops and curling chimney smoke, the peasant stirred. Not because he had slept well, nor because he was rested, but because the work required it. His sleep had been shallow, shared with children and wife, and perhaps a goat pressed against the wall for warmth. There had been coughing and creaking and the soft sounds of wind pushing at the shutter. But now it was time. Time to rise. To pull on the same garments as yesterday, rough wool, patched many times, and lace the same shoes, if he had any, or wrap his feet with rags again. There was no breakfast waiting, only a crust of bread, perhaps dipped in yesterday's pottage, now cold. There was little conversation. The fire was poked, stirred back to life. If embers remained from the night, they would spark easily. If not, someone would blow and pray and feed the ashes with straw until it caught again. The peasant stood, stretched a tired back, and stepped outside. The fields lay beyond the village, not far by today's standards, but distant enough to feel in the joints and in the cold. The walk was part of the day, a quiet ritual that happened before the work could even begin. The paths were not paved. They were not marked. They were made by repetition, feet treading the same line between homes and pasture, season after season. In spring, they were muddy. In summer, dusty. In autumn, slick with falling leaves. In winter, frozen. The peasant walked with tools slung over his shoulder, a hoe, perhaps, or a wooden rake. If oxen were needed, they were already at the edge of the field, waiting, tethered to a tree, or guided by another laborer. There were few words exchanged between workers. Everyone knew their place and their task. The silence of the morning was only broken by birds, or the occasional bark of a dog, or the slow clop of hooves from a passing cart. The land they walked to was not their own. That was understood. It was the Lord's domain, the portion of the manor kept for the benefit of the landowner. The peasants did not farm for profit or for food, but out of duty. It was part of their rent, part of their bond to land. For some, it was 2 days a week. For others, 3 or 4. During harvest, it might become every day. The details were different from village to village, manor to manor, but the principle was the same. The Lord's fields came first. Only after the work was done, the furrows dug, the grain sown, the sheaves gathered, could the peasant return to tend his own tiny plot. The field itself was large, but not a single stretch. Medieval farming relied on the open field system, a communal landscape divided into long, narrow strips. Each peasant held a number of these strips scattered throughout the field, assigned by custom or local agreement. There were no fences, no hedges, only landmarks, a large tree, a bend in the stream, a stone that had always been there. The land was plowed in long arcs, and planting was done by hand. One man might walk, swing his arm in a practiced rhythm, scattering seed from a worn leather pouch. Behind him, others might follow with rakes, or with sharpened sticks to press the seeds into soil. There were no tractors, no fertilizers, only sweat and time and knowledge passed down from father to son. The plow, when used, was pulled by oxen, not horses. Horses were faster, but they required better food, and that was a luxury. Oxen were slow, stubborn, and strong. The wooden plowshare cut shallowly into the earth. It was not ideal, but it was what they had. The furrows were uneven. The soil turned slowly. But over hours, the field began to change from a flat brown expanse of rows of upturned earth, glistening with moisture, dotted with bits of root and stone. The work bent the body. It pulled at the back, the knees, the shoulders. A peasant who lived into his 40s often stooped, not from age, but from repetition. There were breaks, but not many. A short pause to drink, a bite of bread, then work resumed. There were no meals delivered, no shaded tents, no midday rest, only the cycle of effort and continuation. The weather was not consulted. If it rained, they worked. If the sun burned, they worked. Only snow might delay them. And even then, there were tools to be sharpened, carts to be repaired, thatch to be gathered. No day was truly free. During the harvest, urgency ruled everything. Grain had to be reaped at the right moment, not too green, not too dry. It was cut with sickles, bundled into sheaves, and stacked in small piles to dry. The threshing came later, done by flail in barns or on open ground. Each stalk beaten to separate grain from chaff. Dust filled the air. It clung to skin and hair. There was no machinery, only rhythm. Swing, lift, for hours, for days, for as long as it took. At the end of the day, the walk home was slower. Tools were heavier. Clothes were dirted. Hands were blistered, even if calloused. The peasant returned to his cottage not with pride, but with relief. The fire would be lit. The children would ask about supper. A bowl of pottage, a crust of bread. If the stars were visible, he might glance up once, before ducking inside. There was no reward, no praise, no additional grain for good work. Only the knowledge that tomorrow would be the same. And the day after, and the season after. Some seasons were good. The rain came in time. The sun was mild. The grain grew tall and gold. Other years, everything went wrong. Too much rain, or none at all. A late frost, a swarm of insects, blight. In those years, the harvest failed. But the dues to the Lord did not. The peasants still owed their portion, still owed labor, still owed eggs and chickens and bushels of barley. The system did not bend. And so they walked, each morning, each season, each year, to the same fields, with the same tools, under the same sky. To imagine medieval farming tools is to imagine simplicity, not sleek devices or shining blades, but shapes carved from necessity. Tools not forged in iron-rich workshops, but formed in village sheds with dull blades, worn hands, and the limited materials available. The average peasant did not possess a chest of implements, nor a row of sharpened scythes or plows lined in a shed. Instead, he had a few essential pieces, mostly wood, occasionally reinforced with metal, but not always. And when iron was used, it was thin, precious, a small strip hammered into a worn wooden handle, a rim around a wheel, a blade tied with twine. Metal was not abundant. It was not for the peasant. The village smith might make nails, hinges, or thin tools, but even these had to be conserved. If something broke, it was repaired. If it could not be repaired, it was repurposed. If it could not be repurposed, it was burned. The most common tool was the hoe, a basic device, a wooden shaft with a flat or slightly curved blade affixed at the end, used for breaking clods, clearing weeds, and softening the ground before planting. Most peasants owned one, or shared one between families. It was heavy, but not too heavy. The blade dull, but serviceable. With it, fields could be scraped into furrows or garden patches churned with rough hands. After hours of swinging, the motion became rhythm. Back, forth, press, lift. Like most tools, it wore the worker more than the worker wore it. Then there was the fork, not the kind used at tables. Few peasants had those, but the kind used in barns and haylofts. A long pole with 2 or 3 wooden tines, carved from a branch and steamed into shape, used to toss straw or turn drying hay. It was not elegant. It was not sharp, but it served its purpose. It was light. It did not rust. And when it broke, it could be made again with a few hours' work and a strong tree limb. The sickle, on the other hand, required a blade, a curved piece of iron sharpened periodically on a stone, used to harvest grain. With the sickle, peasants would bend over rows of wheat or barley and cut stalks one handful at a time. It was slow. The hand held the grain. The blade sliced. Then another. Then another. In some places, a larger scythe was used, longer handle, longer arc. But this was more dangerous and often reserved for hay. The rhythm of the scythe was hypnotic. Swing, step, step. The sound of the blade through dry grass. But the scythe was heavier and required space. The sickle was more intimate. close to the earth, laborious. For planting, there was a dibber, a stick or staff, sometimes with a pointed iron tip, used to poke holes into the soil. Seeds were dropped in by hand, covered again by hand. There were no machines, no rows of perfect spacing, just effort day after day. Sometimes children helped, scattering seed from cloth pouches slung over their shoulders. Sometimes older women walked behind, covering the holes with their feet. It was slow, but it worked. The plow, when available, was the grandest of the peasant's tools, though often owned not by the peasant, but by the manor. It was made of heavy wood, with a small iron shear at the bottom to cut the soil. Drawn by oxen, it sliced shallow furrows into the field. The person guiding it walked behind, hands on the frame, leaning forward as the animals trudged ahead. The depth depended on the soil. The quality depended on the weather. It was not efficient. It was not precise. But it was essential. Without the plow, larger plots would take weeks to dig by hand. For winnowing, after the grain was threshed, peasants used baskets, wide, flat trays woven from willow or hazel. The grain was tossed into the air, and the wind separated chaff from seed. There was no engine, no fan, only timing and patience. It was a communal task, done outside, in a clearing, with hands working quickly. Then the grain was bagged, stored, taxed, counted, and the process began again the next year. Axes were used, but not for cutting down trees. That was often forbidden. The Lord owned the forest. The peasant could gather fallen branches, but felling a tree without permission could lead to punishment. Axes were used to split logs, trim beams, or carve stakes. A good axe might last a decade. If the head fell loose, it was hammered back on. If the handle cracked, it was wrapped in leather or replaced. There were also hammers, mallets, adzes, and spades, all wooden or mostly wooden. Iron tips, if available, were thin and riveted. These tools were not bought in shops. They were passed down, repaired, altered. If a tool was too damaged to use, its handle might become firewood. Its head might become a wedge. Nothing was wasted. Even buckets were tools, for carrying water, for mixing daub, for holding grain, made from wooden slats, bound with rope or iron hoops. Leaky buckets were patched with pitch. Rope handles frayed and were replaced with twisted flax. A single bucket might last 20 years, if cared for, and of course, there were hands, the most important tools of all. Rough, calloused, blistered, cracked. Nails dark with soil. Knuckles swollen from years of repetition. The peasants' hands did not rest. They lifted, pulled, dug, pushed, planted, reaped. In the absence of machines, everything depended on the body, and the body, in turn, depended on the tools it carried. There were no brands, no craftsmanship for its own sake. A tool was judged not by elegance, but by how long it lasted. And even then, it was never really owned. The earth wore it down. The weather broke it. The labor consumed it, just as it consumed the person holding it. In a modern museum, these tools look primitive. They sit behind glass, clean, still, their edges worn smooth by centuries of wind and time. But in their day, they were not curiosities. They were lifelines. They were extensions of the peasant's will, the means by which survival was scratched from stubborn earth. No machines, no gears, no fuel, only wood, iron, rope, and hands. The peasant's world was not one of ownership, but of obligation. In the medieval countryside, very few things truly belonged to the peasant. Not the land, not the tools, not even the time that passed between dawn and dusk. Everything that defined a peasant's existence came with strings attached, unwritten but deeply understood. The house they lived in was built by their hands, yes, but on land owned by the Lord. The small garden outside, where onions and cabbage might grow between stones, was cultivated by the family, but it was not theirs. The field where grain was planted, plowed, and harvested, it might have been worked by 3 generations of the same family, but the legal right to it rested entirely with the landowner. This was not tenancy as we understand it now. There were no leases, no contracts to sign. Rights were customary, inherited, fragile, and always conditional. A peasant could lose his plot for failing to meet obligations. A poor harvest might be forgiven once. A second might invite eviction, and the land would be reassigned. There were always others willing to take it, or required to do so. The structure of this obligation was known as feudalism, a system less about governance and more about mutual expectations, layered like sediment. At the top was a king, who owned everything in theory. Beneath him, the nobles and lords, who held land in return for military service and loyalty. Below them were knights, reeves, and stewards. And at the very bottom, the peasants, bound not by iron chains but by tradition and necessity. A peasant might be called a serf, a villain, or a khatar. The labels varied by region and time period, but the reality was much the same. The peasant worked the land, paid dues, and in return received the right to exist. It was a system that conferred responsibility without power. If a dispute arose over land or animals or inheritance, it was a lord's court that decided. The peasant had no legal standing beyond what was permitted by custom. Obligation took many forms. There was labor obligation, work in the lord's fields a certain number of days each week. This labor came before the peasant's own needs. If a storm was coming, and the harvest on the peasant's plot was at risk, he might still be required to reap the lord's grain first. There was rent, paid in kind, chickens, eggs, a portion of the barley, or a pig at Markmas. There were fees for using the mill, the bakehouse, or the wine press. These were not optional. The peasant could not grind grain at home. The lord's mill was required, and a portion of the flour was taken as payment. The same with the oven. Baking bread at home risked punishment. Even marriage could require a fee, especially if the bride or groom came from another manor. Death brought obligations too. A portion of the peasant's belongings, often the best animal, passed to the lord as a heriot. These burdens were enforced by social pressure as much as law. Everyone in the village knew who paid and who didn't. The reeve, often a peasant himself, was responsible for keeping track, collecting dues, organizing labor teams, reporting to the bailiff. Refusing to work or missing obligations meant not just fines but ostracism. A man seen as shirking duty might find his neighbors less willing to help him when his roof collapsed or when a cow went missing. The web of obligation was not just vertical, but horizontal. Peers depending on peers to carry the weight together. And yet, within this strict structure, there was a kind of stability. A man knew what was expected. He might work 6 days a week, year after year, but he also knew he would not be cast out without cause. The land might not be his, but it would pass to the son. His cottage, patched with years of effort, might still stand long after he was gone. There was security in predictability, even if that security came without autonomy. The peasant could not rise in station, but nor was he likely to fall further. Below him lay only the landless poor, wanderers, beggars, outcasts who had slipped through the cracks of obligation and now lived at the mercy of others. The question of ownership then becomes one of perspective. To modern minds, ownership means control, independence, the right to improve or change. To the medieval peasant, it meant continuity, the ability to live on a land, to raise a family there, to sow and reap and repeat the process without interference. True independence was unimaginable. The system was total. Even the church owned land. Monks held vast estates worked by laborers who tied both to their worldly lord and to their heavenly one. And so the peasant moved through life not as a free agent, but as a participant in an ancient and rigid dance. He stepped where custom told him to step. He worked when called. He gave what was due. And in return, he was allowed to remain on his land, in his cottage, among his people. It was not freedom, but it was survival. And for most, that was enough. Above the thatched rooftops, above the steaming hearths and muddy tracks of the village, rose a steeple. If there was one, not every village had a church with stone walls and a tower. But every peasant lived under the towering weight of the church, not as a structure, but as a presence. It filled the rhythms of daily life, the cycle of the seasons, and the space beyond death. It was not just religion, it was regulation. Not just worship, but authority. The church watched the soul, but also shaped the calendar, taxed the harvest, defined sin, permitted or forbade. A peasant might never speak to a noble, never visit a city, never see a royal decree, but he would know the priest. The priest would know his sins, and the church would know how many eggs he owed. It is easy, from a modern standpoint, to see religion as private, something interior, chosen, questioned. But for the medieval peasant, belief was not optional. It was ambient. The air was Christian. The fields were Christian. The laws were Christian. A child was baptized before it had teeth. A man confessed before he died. A woman tied from her chickens. And a priest stood between them and hereafter. Not with mercy, always, but with instruction. The church taught not just about heaven, but about hell. Not just about hope, but about failure. And it was always watching. Each week was structured around Sunday Massachusetts. This was not optional. Even if the peasant did not understand a Latin word spoken, and most did not, they attended. They knelt. They crossed themselves. They repeated what they had been taught. There was no seating, no pews. The floor was stone or packed earth. Families stood or crouched or leaned. Babies cried. Smoke from candles curled in the dimness. The priest chanted, lifted the host, made the sign of the cross. The peasants watched. They were not participants in the modern sense. The altar was distant. The mystery literal. Confession came less often, but it came. And when it did, it was a reminder. Your thoughts are not private. Your actions, your desires, your anger, your lies. These are known to God and must be made known to the priest. Forgiveness required honesty. Honesty required humility, and penance followed. A prayer, a task, a warning. Then there were the tithes. 1/10 of the peasant's produce, or income, or time, paid to the church. This might be in grain, or eggs, or a portion of cloth. In some regions, it was paid in labor, working the priest's land, repairing the chapel, fetching water for the holy font. It was a burden, but it was not seen as theft. It was duty, sacred obligation. To withhold tithes was not just to defy the priest. It was to defy God. Religious festivals dotted the year, more than 30 in many regions. Feast days for saints, for Mary, for the apostles. These were breaks from labor, yes, but also filled with expectation. Processions, prayers, fasting. Lent came each spring, forbidding meat, requiring penance. Advent prepared for Christ's coming. Easter was joy. Christmas was solemn. The peasant did not count the months by names. He knew them by saints, by planting, by the days he could eat meat and the days he could not. The church also controlled marriage. A peasant could not marry without its blessing. And if the marriage broke, through violence, abandonment, infertility, there was no divorce, only separation. The priest might intervene, might counsel, might forbid. Children born outside marriage were marked, not just in name, but in status. Their souls were suspect, their future uncertain. Death was watched as closely as life. A peasant who died without confession risked purgatory, or worse. Burials were blessed. Graves faced east. Offerings were made. A coin placed for the priest. A prayer spoken by the family. The dead were not gone. They were waiting, and the living were responsible for them. Masses could be paid for. The priest would pray for the soul. A luxury, but one that many peasants saved for. Not for themselves, but for their parents, their children, their neighbors. Superstition bled into this faith, of course. The church condemned magic, but the peasant believed in charms, in saints who healed warts, in relics that cured blindness. A splinter of wood, said to be from the true cross. A vial of dust, said to be from a holy tomb. These circulated slowly. Rumors passed from village to village. Pilgrimages were made, long walks to shrines with aching feet and borrowed food. Not for fun, for penance, for hope. Sin was everywhere. To work on Sunday was a sin. To speak rudely to the priest. To lust. To steal. To lie. To envy. Even in thought. Even in dream. The peasant carried these sins quietly, uncertainly, confessing what he remembered, fearing what he forgot. A thunderstorm might be punishment. A sick child might be a sign. A poor harvest could be blamed on sin. The priest was not always wise, not always kind. Some were poor themselves, others were powerful, but all were above the peasant in status. They could read, they could write, they spoke Latin, they had access to books, books chained to church pulpits, written by hand, decorated in gold. The peasant had no books. He had memory. He had songs. He had the priest's word. And yet, the church was not just control. It was also the only source of comfort. It told the peasant that suffering was holy, that Jesus had suffered too, that the poor would be first in heaven, that justice would come not in this world, but in the next, that prayers mattered, that candles lit for the dead brought warmth to the lost, that even a peasant, nameless and bent, mattered to God. So the peasant crossed himself before each meal. He prayed before sleep. He feared judgment. He hoped for grace. He saw the church not as separate, but as a fabric woven through his days. And in that fabric, however tattered, he found something to hold. In the medieval peasant's world, illness did not arrive with diagnosis or a plan. It came quietly, often at night, with a cough that wouldn't stop, a fever that did not break, or a swelling beneath the skin that grew warm and red. There was no vocabulary for it beyond what was observed and feared. A child who stopped eating. A man who could no longer rise from bed. A woman whose body shivered despite the fire. Sickness came often, and it came everyone. The young, the old, the strong, the careful. It came in the changing seasons, with the damp, with the fleas and flies, and with the mysteries that peasants could not name. There were no hospitals, no trained doctors as we understand them, no clinics, no prescriptions. Illness was endured, not treated. What healing there was came from within the village, from the old woman who knew herbs, from a neighbor who had seen this before, from a priest who offered prayer and holy water. Medicine, in the peasant sense, meant plants and patience. It meant bitter teas brewed from bark or root, and poultices pressed onto wounds. It meant laying still and hoping. Some plants were known. Willow for pain, yarrow for bleeding, garlic for the stomach. But none were certain, and some could harm as easily as help. The line between healing and hurting was thin. No peasant could read a manual. Knowledge was oral, passed down, remembered, modified with experience. When sickness lingered, the home changed. A straw bed near the fire, a bowl of water on the floor, a cloth for the brow. Other tasks were set aside. The sick needed tending, but there were no clean linens, no antiseptics. The idea of infection, of invisible agents carried on breath or touch, was unknown. Illness was thought to come from bad air, from sin, from imbalance in humors. Blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile. A theory borrowed from ancient Greece, filtered through monasteries and passed on by priests. But for the peasant, the humors were not symbols. They were distant ideas. What mattered was the body. Pale, hot, clammy, cold. The most feared illnesses were those that spread. The plague, of course, would come centuries later in waves. A terror of swelling, vomiting, and death within days. But even before that, diseases like smallpox, leprosy, dysentery, and tuberculosis haunted the villages. Skin that erupted in sores. Breathing that grew shallower each night. Children who weakened without clear cause. Diarrhea that did not stop. The names were simple. The wasting, the pox, the shaking, the fever. They were not medical terms. They were labels of fear. When a person died, there was no embalming. The body was washed, usually by women in the family. It was wrapped in cloth, sometimes sewn into a shroud, and buried quickly, within a day if possible. The grave was shallow. The churchyard was small. A wooden marker, if any. A stone, if the family was respected or the deceased was old. There were no headstones for most. The ground was used again and again. Bones shifted with time. Sometimes illness took one. Sometimes it took many. Entire families could be emptied in a month. Villages weakened. Fields untended. There was no one to write it down. No record beyond memory. A neighbor would say, "He died in the fever." Or, "They all died last spring." And life went on. The fire still needed tending. The cow still needed milking. Childbirth was especially dangerous. For the mother, the risk of death was always near, from blood loss, infection, or the child simply being too large. There were midwives, yes, but no doctors. A successful birth was met with cautious joy. Many infants died within days or weeks. Those who survived were not named for weeks, sometimes longer, a kind of emotional protection. The church baptized them quickly to secure their souls, but the family waited before hoping too much. The cemetery held many small graves. The family held many quiet memories. The church offered spiritual healing, but rarely physical. A priest might bless the sick, might sprinkle holy water, might anoint with oil. He might prescribe prayer, penance, or fasting. Miracles were possible, it was said, but not common. For most peasants, healing meant time, rest, luck, or acceptance. Death was not seen as a failure. It was part of life. Souls passed on. Bodies returned to earth. Tears were shed, but not loudly. Mourning was subdued. There was no time to wail. And yet, the fear remained. Every sore, every shiver could be the start. Mothers watched their children with quiet panic. Wives observed their husbands' coughs. Elders felt each ache and wondered. There was no cure, no prevention, only habits. Some burned herbs indoors to cleanse the air. Some wore charms. Some tied holy tokens around the wrist. Superstition met survival in a kind of quiet desperation. There were pilgrimages to healing shrines, places said to hold holy power, springs that cured blindness, stones that healed limbs. A peasant might walk for days, carrying a sick child or leading a blind parent, just to touch the relic, to leave a token, to hope. These journeys were hard, the road dangerous, but they were sometimes the only thing a family could do. Time passed. Some recovered. Some did not. The lucky grew old, into their 40s, maybe 50s. They became the storytellers. They remembered the worst years. They warned the young. But even the old coughed in winter. Their hands shook. Their teeth were few. And one day, they did not rise. The world of the peasant did not offer medicine in bottles or surgery with blades. It offered herbs, warmth, rest, and the will to endure. And if that was not enough, it offered prayer and earth. To step into a medieval village was to step into a world not only of sights and sounds, but of smells, deep, constant, inescapable smells that clung to clothing, to skin, to the very walls of the home. These smells were not momentary. They were permanent. They lingered, soaked into thatch, into wool, into earth. A traveler might notice them immediately. But to the peasant who had never known another world, they were background, like the wind or the smoke from a hearth. Invisible, but everywhere. They shaped the day without announcing themselves. Each scent told a story. In the morning, as the village stirred, there was a scent of smoke, thin and dry in summer, damp and choking in winter. Every home had a hearth. There were no chimneys. The smoke crept out through holes in the roof, through cracks in the wall, or hovered indoors until it found a way out. The air inside a cottage was often blue with it. Eyes watered, throats tickled, walls blackened. But fire was life. It meant warmth and light and food. The smell of smoke was the smell of survival. Mixed into the air was the scent of straw, fresh when laid, sour as it aged. Straw was everywhere. It covered floors. It padded beds. It lined animal pens. It was trampled, slept on, tossed aside, replaced in layers. Over time, it absorbed everything, spilled milk, sweat, dirt, waste. And so it grew musty, sour, familiar. Animals were always near. A cow in a shed, a pig under the eaves, chickens nesting in corners. They were not distant creatures penned in clean barns. They were companions, sometimes unwelcome, but always present. They dropped waste where they stood. They ate, burped, scratched. The smell of animals was the smell of manure, rich, wet, sharp. In spring, it was thick in the air, as fields were fertilized with night soil and dung. The peasants spread it by hand. There were no gloves, no masks, just the work and the smell of it. The human waste had its place too. There were no toilets, no running water, a bucket in the corner, a pit at the edge of the village. a ditch between plots. Waste was collected and flung. Some was composted. Some left to soak into the ground. In summer, it baked. In winter, it froze. But it was always there, rising with the warmth of the day, heavy in the stillness of evening. Cooking brought other smells, comforting if plain. Boiled grain, leek and onion, turnip, cabbage, always cabbage. The kind of cooking that lingered, that softened over hours, that filled the one-room cottage and seeped into the timbers. No spices, save for salt, if available. No sugar, just a slow, earthy blend of root and broth. It was food. It was heat, and it added its own layer to the tapestry of smell. Then there were people who rarely bathed. Water was cold and not always clean. Soap was rare. And there was little point. Sweat returned by midday. Bodies smelled of labor, of wool soaked in rain, of leather never dried, of shoes that had seen too many seasons. The smell of people was real and close. Clothes were worn for weeks. Underclothes, if any, were washed rarely. Children ran barefoot through mud. Women wiped hands on aprons. Men sweated into tunics that never saw the inside of a wash tub. And over time, it became not just an odor, but a presence. The scent of community. The seasons changed the air. Spring brought the smell of thawing earth, of wet straw, of smoke that clung longer to the cold. Summer added the sharpness of sweat, and the rot of food gone too long. Autumn was the scent of apples, grain dust, crushed leaves, and animals slaughtered for winter, blood in the dirt, fat in the smokehouse. Winter was quiet, more smoke, less rot, but heavier air indoors, crowded rooms, damp wool, stale breath. There were occasional interruptions. A storm might clear the air. A fresh load of straw might bring brightness. A new baby might arrive, washed in herbs. A traveler might pass through, bringing foreign odors, of oil, of wine, of city filth. But the core smells remained, persistent, layered, expected. Visitors from higher stations sometimes remarked on it. The peasant stench, they called it. But the peasant did not mind. It was not filth. It was life. Each smell was a marker of activity, a sign that things were growing or cooking or changing. It meant the hearth was burning. The cow was healthy. The bread was rising. It meant the cycle was continuing. When illness came, the smell changed. A different kind of rot. A sweetness in the breath. A dampness to the body. The smell of fever. Those who had seen it before could tell. The room grew quieter. The herbs were burned. The windows opened, if they could, but even then, the familiar odors held fast, a reminder that life still hummed around the sickbed. Festivals brought rare changes. The scent of flowers worn in hair, of ale spilled in joy, of roasted meat if the Lord was generous. But these were brief, and the next day, the usual smells returned. There was no escaping it, no window to throw open, no bath to wash it all away. There was only adaptation, only acceptance. The peasant breathed in the world. He worked. He carried it with him. In his hair, in his clothes, in the creases of his hands. It was not good or bad. It was just there. In a world without watches, without bells in every home, without flashing digits on walls or wrists, the medieval peasant lived not by the ticking of time, but by the rhythm of the earth. There were no alarms, no countdowns, no standardized hours. The day was measured in light. The year was measured in seasons. And within those seasons, life unfolded with a predictability, both comforting and unrelenting. To the peasant, time was not a number. It was a feeling, a certain slant of the sun, a coolness in the air, a softness of ground, a change in the birdsong. The body knew it before the mind did. Spring began not on a specific date, but when the soil could be turned again, when the last of the frost melted, when the first shoots pushed through the ground like timid fingers. It was muddy, yes, and cold and uncertain, but it was also the season of movement. The plow was pulled from its resting place. Hoes were sharpened. Seeds were taken from storage sacks and measured by hand. Days were longer now, not by hours on a clock, but by the way shadows shifted. The work began early, ended late. Rain fell often. The ground sucked at boots. Children, if old enough, helped with planting, scattering seed, pressing it down, patting the dirt. The smell of turned soil was strong. The air was rich with birds and hope. But it was not easy. Nothing was guaranteed. A frost could still return. Seeds could rot. But spring was a promise. Thin and trembling, but a promise nonetheless. Summer was not leisure. It was labor. The sun was high. The weeds grew tall, and every living thing needed tending. Gardens had to be watched. Livestock grazed further afield. There were nettles to pull, fences to mend, and the first hay to cut. The peasant worked with sweat trickling down the spine, clothes damp and clinging. The sky was wide and blue, the days long and hot. There was no shade in the field. The body adjusted. Meals were eaten cold. Water was drunk from the stream. The village buzzed with insects and the creaking of carts. At night, the air stayed warm. Doors were left ajar. Straw mats were laid outside to cool. But even in summer, the thought of harvest loomed. Everything led to it. The grain swelled in the fields. The fruits ripened. The whole year's hope rested on these weeks. A hailstorm could ruin it. So could too much heat. Or not enough. Autumn was heavy. The harvest came fast. There was no time for ceremony. Reaping meant sickles in every hand. It meant sheaves gathered by children. It meant carts piled high, pulled by groaning oxen. Everyone worked. Even the old, even the sick. The air was filled with chaff and dust. Eyes stung, backs ached. But the work was done because it had to be. Grain was stored in sacks, in pits, in barns they existed. Apples were dried. Beans were tied. Cabbage was salted. It was a time of gathering, of cramming the year's labor into the corners of the home. The light began to dim earlier. The mornings were cool. The birds left. The sky changed color. And then, slowly, the fields emptied again. The animals were brought closer. Firewood was stacked. The peasant counted what he had. And always it was not quite enough. Winter was not stillness. It was not peace. It was waiting. The days were short. The darkness came before the work was done. Frost curled around windows. The earth hardened. Most of the day was spent inside, mending, twisting rope, carving tools, repairing clothes. But even so, there was always something to tend. A cow still needed milking. A sheep might still give birth. Ice had to be broken to reach water. Wood had to be gathered daily. The cold was a constant guest. It slipped through walls. It slept beside the hearth. Fires burned low to save fuel. Smoke hung in the rafters. Meals were thin. Lentils, cabbage, sometimes only broth. It was during winter that illness came most often, and sometimes death. But winter also brought stories. Children huddled close, listening. Elders spoke softly. Time passed more slowly, not because the day was long, but because the world had narrowed. The seasons were the only clock, and within them, smaller signs gave structure to time. The rooster's call marked morning. The church bell, if there was one, marked Sunday. Candles burned to mark prayers. The position of the sun told the peasant when it was time to break, or go home, or return to field. Moon phases were noted. Saints' days remembered. But all of it rested on the land, on the cycles of soil and seed and snow. There were no surprises, only returns. Time passed in repetition. One spring was much like another. So was each winter. The peasant measured age by season survived, not birthdays. A child might be described as born just before flood or in the harsh frost year. Age was relative, and so, in some ways, was memory. What mattered was not minutes, but moments. The day the grain sprouted, the first frost, the day the cow calved, the day the cart broke, the moment the fire caught, or failed to. These were the anchors. And between them, time drifted, not unnoticed, but unmarked. And so, when the peasant looked at the sky, he did not wonder what time it was. He wondered how many hours of light remained. When he stood in the field, he did not think of deadlines. He thought of whether the clouds looked heavy. When he lay in bed, he did not count the hours he had slept. He counted the days left before sowing. or before rent was due, or before the snows returned. Time was not his to manage. It was the land's, and he simply followed. Of all the burdens carried by the medieval peasant, hunger was the most familiar. It was not always dramatic, not always starvation or collapse, but it was always there, lingering like a shadow that stretched from the empty bowls, from the thin broth, from the clink of a single coin where there should have been 10. Hunger, for the peasant, was not an event. It was a condition, a presence, a shape in the corner of a room that was never fully gone. The stomach was rarely full, and when it didn't stay that way for long. There was food, of course, but food was not plentiful, not abundant, not certain. It came in fits and starts, in baskets and handfuls, in clusters of root vegetables pulled from dirt still clinging with ice. The grain harvest was the core of survival. Wheat if one was lucky, barley more likely, rye, oats. The grains were ground into flour, often at the Lord's mill, and there was a fee for that, then turned into bread. But this bread was dense, heavy, not soft, not fluffy, not sweet. It was dark with bran, often coarse with grit from a grinding stone. Eating it wore down teeth, but it filled the belly, even if only briefly. Next to grain were vegetables, but not the variety known today. There were no tomatoes, no corn, no potatoes. Instead, leeks, onions, turnips, cabbages, and peas. These were boiled into stews that might simmer for hours over fire, not to enhance flavor, but to stretch quantity. A pot might last for days. New ingredients added each time. The bottom of the pot never truly empty, just reused, scraped, topped up. This was called perpetual pottage. It was never quite fresh, but it was warm, and it was food. Meat was rare, a luxury. Most peasants ate meat only a few times a year, when an animal was slaughtered when a festival came, or when the Lord offered it. A pig might be raised carefully, fattened on scraps and acorns, and then killed before winter. Its parts salted, smoked, or dried. But that meat had to last. The best cuts might be sold or offered to the manor. The rest became sausage, lard, or soup bones. Chickens were more common, but they were more valuable for their eggs. To eat a laying hen was to sacrifice future meals. So eggs were gathered and traded, and sometimes eaten boiled or baked into thick, doughy cakes. Dairy helped when there was a cow or a goat. Milk turned quickly sour in summer. It was often churned into butter or curdled into cheese. Not soft cheese, not creamy, hard, sharp, rough around the edges. Stored in cloth, sliced thin, stretched as far as possible. Fish could supplement the diet, especially in regions near rivers or coasts. But fishing rights were often restricted. The Lord owned the water. A peasant caught without permission might be fined, or worse. Sometimes, small fish were caught in baskets or nets. Eels, minnows, salted if salt was available, dried if not. The church, in its many rules, banned meat on certain days, nearly half the calendar, which meant fish was required, but not always available. Then there were the gaps, the months where nothing grew and little remained. The hunger gap, it was called in later times, between the last of the winter stores and the first growth of spring. March, April, sometimes May. The granary thinned. The root cellar emptied. The barrels gave up only pickled remnants. Children cried more often. Bellies swelled with water. Weeds and nettles were gathered and boiled. Bread was made with less grain, more filler. Bark, even. Ground beans. Fern root. Moss. These did not nourish. They delayed collapse, but only barely. In bad years, the hunger turned to starvation. When rains fell too long, or not at all. When rot claimed the grain. When locusts came, or mildew, or frost too early. Then the hunger was not a shadow, but a beast. It claimed the weakest first, the old, the already ill, the very young. Infants wasted. Mothers thinned to silence. Men returned from the fields and sat, staring, unable to lift their tools. In such times there were stories not always spoken, but remembered, of theft, of digging to refuse, of eating things not meant be eaten. Grass, bark, cats, dogs, and in the darkest corners of memory, things even worse. But even in ordinary years, fullness was rare. Meals were repetitive. Bread and pottage. Bread and pottage. A thin ale to drink, made from barely fermented grain, safer than water. A scrap of cheese. A slice of onion. The meals did not vary. They sustained but did not satisfy. Work did not stop, and so the stomach always stirred. Children were taught to ignore it. Hunger was treated not as a condition to fix, but as a part of life, like mud on the boots or blisters on the hand. Festivals brought relief, briefly. The Lord might provide meat. Ale might flow freely. A pie might be made. Sweetness was rare, but it appeared, honey, mostly, or dried fruit, save for weeks. For a day or two, the belly might be full. But the next day, the same old pottage awaited. The body remembered, and the hunger returned. The peasant learned to manage it, to eat slowly, to chew long, to drink water before meals, to pretend. But the body knew, it always knew, hunger tightened the skin. It made sleep shallow. It made temper short. It lived in the joints and the bones, whispering with every motion. Still life went on. Work continued. Laughter happened, even with hollow cheeks. Children played. Songs were sung. Hope clung to the corners of every field. Perhaps next year would be better. Perhaps the rain would come. Or not come. Perhaps the new sow would live. Perhaps. The peasant did not expect luxury. He expected the hunger. And so he endured it. The medieval peasant did not have shelter as we imagine it. No insulation, no sturdy beam sealed with modern care, no glass to keep the wind at bay. The home, such as it was, stood with humility. It was built for what the land offered, wattle and daub, a woven lattice of sticks, smeared with mixture of clay, straw, and dung. The walls cracked with time. The rain found the holes. The wind discovered every gap. The thatched roof above, made from reeds or straw, offered some protection from the elements, but it too aged, darkened, and sometimes sagged beneath snow or storm. Mice nested in it. Birds nested in it. Insects lived their entire lives in its thatched maze. It was a roof, yes, but it was not a barrier. Inside, the home was a single room, shared by all. If there was a fire, and there nearly always was, its smoke escaped slowly, crawling through the air until it found a way out. There was no chimney, just a hole in the roof, if one was lucky, or simply an open door. The heat stayed close to the hearth. Just steps away, the air grew cold again. In winter, frost formed inside the house, along the walls, on the bedposts. Breath steamed in the air. The bed, if one had a bed, was piled with straw, wool, and whatever fabric could be found. Families huddled together beneath blankets that smelled of smoke and old hay. Children slept beside parents. Babies clung to warmth, buried in folds. Rain was a steady guest. The roof leaked. Pots were placed to catch the drips. The floor, made of packed earth, turned to mud. Shoes were left outside, or not worn at all. Wind pushed against the home, creaked the walls, blew ash from the fire. A particularly cruel gust might carry away part of thatch, or collapse an outbuilding. Repairs were made with what could be found. There were no hardware stores, no lumber yards, just nearby woods or old branches or the goodwill of neighbors. Snow came with silence. It blanketed the world, clean and cruel, the weight of it pressed on rooftops. Children made paths with their feet. Adults trudged, and always the cold found a way in. There was no escape from it, no second home, no retreat. The peasant lived within the weather, not apart from it. Summer brought its own troubles, not snow or wind, but heat. The thatched roof trapped warmth. The flies gathered. The sweat never dried. The sun burned the skin of those who labored shirtless in the fields. No fans, no shade, save for a tree, if there was time to stop. The peasant learned to rise early, work before the heat grew too harsh, then rest in the midday if the body allowed. But often it did not. Work had to be done. Clothing offered some help. Wool in winter, linen in summer, if one was lucky enough to own both. But wool was heavy when wet, scratchy on the skin, and slow to dry. Linen was rare and precious. Shoes were simple, leather, often patched, sometimes non-existent. Feet grew hard from walking barefoot. Blisters came and went. Rain soaked everything. There was no change of clothes, just a fire to dry them. If it burned strong enough, the weather dictated everything. It decided when to sow, when to reap, when to rest. It dictated whether the harvest would thrive or fail. A season too wet meant rot. Too dry and nothing grew. A storm could flatten a crop overnight. A freeze could kill the cattle. And the peasant could do nothing but wait. There were prayers, of course, processions, offerings to saints. But the sky did not listen. It did what it pleased. And so the peasant adapted, learned to endure, learned to patch and prop, and wait for clear skies, learned that the wind could not be stopped, only suffered. The weather was not an inconvenience. It was a ruler, one without mercy. Clothing for the medieval peasant was not chosen. It was inherited, pieced together, mended, and often a last concern after food and firewood. It was not about style. It was about survival. What a person wore spoke not of taste, but of status, utility, and hardship. Fabric was expensive. Thread was precious, and new garments were a rarity few peasants experienced more than a handful of times in their lives. Every layer was hard-earned, usually handed down, often homespun. And so, a peasant did not dress to feel new or clean or expressive. They dressed to not be cold, or naked, or judged by neighbors. The fabric itched. The seams chafed. The color faded quickly, or was never vibrant to begin with. Browns, grays, and dull greens dominated the village palette, not by choice, but by necessity. The dyes available to peasants were made from plants or bark, or left out altogether. There was no blue, no crimson, no velvet. Those belonged to lords, to clergy, to those whose hands had never plowed a frozen field. The typical outfit for a peasant man began with a simple tunic, a long shirt reaching just above the knees, made from wool, coarsely woven, heavy in winter and lighter, though still rough, in summer. Beneath it, if he was fortunate, he might wear a second linen shirt, though linen was expensive and often reserved for those who could afford to keep a change of clothes. Trousers, often made from a heavy wool as well, were pulled tight with cords or leather. Socks were not common. Instead, wrappings of cloth, wound tightly around the feet and legs, offered the only defense from blisters and cold. On the feet, when shoes existed at all, were basic leather boots, stiff and awkward, shaped to neither comfort nor symmetry. They were repaired often, stitched again and again until the leather itself thinned like paper. Many peasants went barefoot when the weather allowed, not by courage, but by economy. Women wore long woolen dresses, often layered, belted with a rope or strip of leather, an apron, perhaps, if there was cloth to spare, a scarf or kerchief for the head, to keep hair out of the way, to shield against lice, to observe modesty. There were no pockets, no zippers, no convenience. Belongings were tied to belts, carried in hands, or kept in wooden boxes at home. In the cold months, additional cloaks were worn, but cloaks were heavy, shared among families, and often the same ones used to blanket animals or cover the thatch during rain. Clothing was not washed often. Water was precious. Soap, when available, was made from ashes and animal fat, and its use was mostly for hands or the occasional scrubbing of a face before Massachusetts. To bathe an entire outfit required good weather, time, and space to dry, luxuries in short supply. Clothing wore out fast. Knees tore. Elbows thinned. The sun faded every color. The fire stained every hem. And so peasants learned to patch, crudely if needed, bits of fabric saved from dead relatives, from children grown too tall, from sleeves cut short. A peasant's clothing by middle age might be a collection of decades of mending. Every thread had history. Every layer had memory. And if a piece could no longer be worn, it became something else. A rag for cleaning, a wick for a candle, a tie for a bundle of herbs. Nothing was thrown away until it had truly failed. Children wore miniature versions of adult clothing. There were no soft onesies, no warm blankets lined with cotton. Babies were wrapped in whatever could be spared. Small children ran barefoot through summer. Their knees always scraped, their tunics often too big or too small, depending on which sibling had worn it last. As they grew, their clothing was adjusted, not remade, but hemmed, tied, pinned. In winter, children suffered the cold the most. Smaller bodies lost heat faster. Parents shared their cloaks, tucked little ones beneath layers at night. But still, chilblains and frostbite were common. The wind did not care about tenderness. There were no wardrobes, no closets. A peasant's entire set of clothing, often just one outfit for work, and perhaps another for Sunday Mass if the family was lucky, might hang from a single peg on the wall. Cloaks were shared. Hats were uncommon. Gloves, even rarer. Only those who worked as smiths or who had a relative in trade might own anything beyond the basics. And yet, this clothing carried identity. The village knew you by your tunic. A hole in the shoulder, a faded patch on the knee. These became markers, not of shame, but of recognition. He's the one with the green-stained sleeve. She's the one with the red tie on her belt. Special occasions, weddings, feasts, funerals, might see the donning of a borrowed garment, a cleaner shirt, a brighter sash, an old pair of shoes set aside just for walking to church. But these were rare days. Most of life was lived in the same garments, softened only by time and memory. There was a kind of quiet pride in keeping something going. A cloak that had seen 20 winters. A belt that had outlasted a marriage. Even in hardship, there was a dignity to endurance. And through all this, the peasant's body bore the evidence of their clothing. Calloused shoulders were straps rubbed, hips rubbed raw from tight bindings. Fingers stained with dye or soot. Skin hardened to the touch, sun-darkened, wind-chapped. Clothing did not protect as much as it delayed discomfort. It was a fragile barrier between the peasant and the elements, a woven shield held together by labor, memory, and need. It did not aspire to beauty. It aspired to survive the season. For the medieval peasant, then, clothing was not fashion. It was not choice. It was a stitched-together story of survival, worn, washed in streams, dried by fires, patched with memory, and passed on when life allowed. Justice, in the world of the medieval peasant, was not a comfort. It was not a shield. It did not arrive with fairness or even understanding. It arrived slowly, if at all, and when it did, it came down hard. The idea of rights, of appeals, of equality before the law was foreign. Law was not something written on paper and handed out. It was spoken, imposed, and remembered. It came from the Lord, from the manorial court, from the church, or from the local customs passed down by word of mouth. The peasant did not know the laws. He knew the punishments, and that was enough to keep most silent. The lord of the manor held power over justice within his land. He appointed the reeve, a kind of chief peasant officer, who organized labor and reported disputes. For smaller offenses, disputes between neighbors, complaints of stolen firewood, or animals damaging crops, the manor court might be called. It met in a hall or under a tree, presided over by the lord's steward or bailiff. Witnesses were peasants themselves, chosen not for truth, but for availability. There were no lawyers, no defense. The process was short. If the village thought you guilty, you likely were. Reputation mattered more than evidence. Punishments were not complex. They were practical, symbolic, and designed to discourage. A fine, often, paid in coin or goods. A chicken for minor offenses. Grain for others. But fines hurt. A chicken loss meant fewer eggs. A sack of grain meant hunger that winter. Repeat offenders faced public punishment. Stocks in the center of the village, where the body was held by the wrists and ankles, bent in awkward discomfort for hours, sometimes days. Children threw mud. Neighbors whispered. Humiliation was part of the sentence. For more serious crimes, theft, violence, heresy, the punishment grew harsher. A hand might be cut off for repeated stealing. A tongue split for blasphemy. A body lashed until the skin peeled. Branding, sometimes, or exile, which in a world of tight-knit villages and endless forests, was near to a death sentence. A man cast out from his land, without his tools, without kin, often did not live long. There were no support systems. No safety nets. Mercy was rare and mostly reserved for those with status. Sometimes justice was tied to ordeals, a form of divine judgment. Trial by fire, by water, or by combat. A person might be asked to carry hot iron a certain number of paces, or plunge a hand into boiling water, then have the wound bandaged and left for days. If it festered, guilt was confirmed. If it healed clean, innocence was declared. The logic was circular. God would protect the innocent. If you suffered, you must be guilty. But the wounds always festered. The innocent bled just the same as the guilty. The church also held courts, especially for moral crimes like adultery, heresy, or breaking fast during Lent. These could be just as harsh. Confession was not always private. Public penance might be assigned. Wearing sackcloth, standing barefoot before the altar, paying alms you did not have. And for the worst spiritual crimes, excommunication, being cut off from the church, from the sacraments, from burial in sacred ground. For a peasant, this was terrifying. It meant the soul was in danger. It meant even death offered no rest. Peasants were always aware of the thin line between complaint and crime. To speak ill of the Lord was risky. To challenge the priest, worse. Gossip could lead to accusations. A look could be twisted into evidence. And though peasants shared their frustrations, they did so quietly, behind closed doors, or out in the fields where only the crows might listen. The walls had ears. So did the neighbors. And fear was a powerful silence. Even within families, justice was uneven. A husband might beat his wife. A father might punish his children harshly. These were not seen as crimes, but as order. A woman who ran from a husband's violence might find herself shamed rather than sheltered. A child who stole food might be whipped by kin before the manor court even heard the case. Justice was not abstract. It was personal, and it was often private, doled out behind doors, beneath cloaks, in whispered apologies or unspoken bruises. There were no prisons in the modern sense. A village might have a holding cell, a pit or hut, to keep someone until court met. But punishment was not prolonged confinement. It was immediate pain, immediate loss, then back to work. The land did not wait for justice. The fields needed tilling. The animals needed feeding. Even the punished returned to labor. If the crime touched a noble class, if a peasant harmed the Lord's property, or worse, a person, the punishment could be execution, hanging most often, sometimes beheading, though that was usually reserved for those of rank. Executions were public. The whole village came, not out of morbid curiosity, but because attendance was expected. It was a lesson, a warning. Children watched. Women prayed. Men averted their eyes. But all understood the message. Justice was swift, and it was final. And yet, justice was not always cruel. Sometimes, disputes were settled quietly. A pig returned. A fence rebuilt, a handshake in the presence of the reeve. There was a recognition among peasants that they needed each other, that to destroy a neighbor was to weaken the village, that forgiveness, if it could be afforded, was preferable to punishment. But this happened only when trust remained, and trust was a fragile thing. There was no illusion of equality. A lord who killed a peasant might be fined. A peasant who killed a lord would be hanged. Perhaps worse. The system was not balanced. It was not blind. It saw rank and land in favor. Justice, for the peasant, was something to avoid, not to seek. It was like a thunderstorm, dangerous, deafening, and best weathered quietly. So the peasant lived carefully. Not fearfully, but cautiously. He watched his words. She minded her place. They taught their children to obey, to endure, to stay out of sight, because in their world, justice was not protection. It was power, and power was never on their side. To the medieval peasant, the church was not merely a building of stone or timber sitting at the edge of the village. It was the very air they breathed, the fabric that wrapped around every season, every ritual, every fear. There were no days without the church, no weeks where its presence faded. It watched, it whispered, it weighed, and it shaped not only belief, but the rhythm of existence itself. Life was not secular. There was no separation. From birth to death, The peasant moved through the world as a soul awaiting judgment, guided, prodded, and occasionally punished by the invisible hand of heaven. The bells marked time. If the village was fortunate enough to have a bell tower, the day would begin with its echo, not to rouse for work. That was already assumed, but to call the faithful to prayer. Morning bells, noon bells, evening bells. Even the rhythm of labor bowed to liturgy. The ringing cut through fog and frost alike, a dull, slow voice that reminded everyone, God is watching. Whether a peasant owned a spoon or not, they belonged to the church. Baptism ensured that. As infants, they were brought wrapped in coarse cloth, still red and wailing, held before the priest who mumbled Latin none could understand but all revered. Water on the head, a name, a beginning. Even if the child did not survive the week, at least the soul had been claimed. The church dictated the calendar. 2. There were holy days and feast days and saints' days and fasts. And more fasts. Nearly half the year was shaped by abstention. No meat, no celebrations, no marriages. These rules arrived not with flexibility, but with threat. To ignore them was not a matter of preference, but of eternal peril. The peasant might not read scripture. Almost none could read at all, but they listened. Sermons were given every Sunday, often in Latin, but occasionally paraphrased by the local priest into common tongue. Tales of fire and brimstone, of saints who bled for their faith, of sinners cast into pits, and the blessed who shone like gold. The stories frightened children and haunted adults. And that was the point. Inside the church building, cold and echoing, the peasant felt very small. The walls were tall, the windows few, and the light dim. Sometimes a candle flickered on the altar. Sometimes a carved crucifix stared back in the front, pale and wooden and worn by time. There were no pews for sitting. Worship was done standing or kneeling. Confession was whispered in dark corners. And communion, when given, was taken with fear. Bread, that was not really bread. Wine that was said to be blood. The mystery was complete and unquestioned. And yet, despite its grandeur and its Latin chants, the church was not far away. The priest was a part of the village, or near it, sometimes indifferent, sometimes kind, occasionally cruel. He heard confessions, blessed marriages, anointed the dying, and buried the dead. He might own land. He might collect tithes, 1/10 of a peasant's harvest, paid not in coin, but in chickens, grain, or labor. This was not optional. To deny the tithe was to risk censure, and perhaps worse, a soul left unshriven, a corpse left unburied, an infant denied baptism. The spiritual and material merged, inseparably. Fear of hell was very real. The images described, of flames, torment, demons with hooked claws and twisted faces, were spoken with detail, and these were not metaphors. A peasant did not imagine an abstract afterlife. They envisioned literal torture, a life of hardship followed by eternity in pain, unless they obeyed, unless they confessed, unless they fasted and gave and bent their heads low. But even heaven was not comfort. It was distant, golden for the saints and the blessed. A peasant hoped, perhaps, for purgatory, a long, painful washing before heaven's gate. The church also held records of birth, of death, of sin. It remembered who missed Mass, who quarreled with their neighbor, who gave less than they should. Gossip passed through its halls as much as Scripture. A woman who bore a child too soon after marriage might be summoned. A man too fond of drink might be publicly named. A heretic, rare but feared, might vanish altogether. The church did not always forgive quickly, and it never forgot. But the church also offered hope. In a world where crops failed and children died and justice was arbitrary, the idea that suffering had purpose gave the peasant a kind of strength. Pain could be redemptive, poverty holy, obedience rewarded. If not in this life, then in the next. The saints became examples. The Virgin Mary a source of comfort. Christ a figure who had suffered too. And so, when the peasant knelt on straw-covered floors, clutching a splintered cross, it was not always fear they felt. Sometimes it was peace, or something close to it. Church festivals broke the gloom. Feast days were times of celebration, color, procession. Candles lit the dark. Hymns echoed. Sometimes food was shared. Ale flowed. Dances erupted, loosely tolerated. These moments, though brief, gave a kind of rhythm to the year, like breaths between the long sentences of labor. Marriage was a sacrament, burial a rite, even illness, when extreme, brought the priest to the door, oil on the brow, a whispered prayer. The body mattered. So did the soul, and both were always under watch. Superstition, too, was folded into the church's shadow, a charm against the evil eye, a whispered prayer before entering the forest, a scrap of bone said to be from a saint, tied with string and worn around the neck. The church condemned such things, but it also allowed them unofficially, quietly, because fear was too deep to unteach. And in the absence of certainty, peasants reached for anything they could. Thus, the church was both weight and refuge, a presence both comforting and severe. It offered no freedom, only structure. No questions, only answers. But in a life of hunger, cold, and loss, that was sometimes enough. A candle in the dark, flickering, yes, and distant, but a light nonetheless. In the medieval village, the notion of childhood, as we understand it today, did not truly exist. There were no stages of innocence carefully protected, no long years of play and wonder guarded from responsibility. A child was not seen as a world apart from the adult, but as an adult in waiting. The line between infancy and labor was thin, and it blurred earlier than most would wish. To be born a peasant child was to inherit a role, not a dream, a place in the field, a place beside the hearth, a duty not later, but soon. And so, though children played, laughed, and loved, their lives were shaped from the start by need, by expectation, and by work. From the moment they could walk, children were drawn into the rhythm of the household. A toddler might be found near the fire, blowing softly on kindling. A child, therefore, might be sent to chase hens, to gather eggs, to carry water in buckets nearly as large as their torso. There was no waiting for school, no early morning ride to lessons or long afternoons with paper and pen. Few children ever held a book. Even fewer could read. The knowledge passed to them came by voice, by observation, by repetition. How to turn the soil with a foot-held hoe. How to pull a weed without uprooting the crop. How to spin wool. To patch clothes. To stir a pot without letting the porridge burn. These were the lessons. These were the books. Play did exist, but it was brief and often blended with work. A stick could become a sword. A handful of stones, a game. Chasing geese through the grass brought laughter and helped herd the flock. The line between amusement and task was always thin. Even the toys, when they existed, were homemade. A doll of rags and straw, a carved figure whittled by a tired father beside the fire. These were not possessions for show. They were small moments of joy carved out from days of structure. The expectations placed on children were great. By 7, a child might be tasked with watching younger siblings for hours at a time. By 10, a boy might be trusted with plowing alongside his father, guiding oxen with hands still soft. A girl might be sewing, tending the hearth, or assisting in the birth of livestock. There was pride in this and pressure. Mistakes had consequences. A spilled bucket meant no water for the evening. A forgotten gate could let animals loose. A neglected fire could cost a day's meal. Responsibility came not with reward, but with the simple acknowledgement of being old enough. Children learned quickly that the world was not gentle. Death came often and early. Many did not survive infancy, weakened by hunger, claimed by fever, taken by infections with no names. Mothers watched helplessly as children coughed through the night, as skin flushed or paled, as breath slowed. And if the child died, there was no soft ceremony, no psychologist or gentle explanation. The village dug a small grave. The priest said what he could, and the family, sometimes silent, returned to work. Grief was real, but rarely visible. Life demanded continuation. If a child survived those early years, they were expected to earn their keep. There were no allowances, no weekends, just the turning of the seasons, the endless tasks. Even learning a trade did not mean escape. An apprenticeship was long and binding, often beginning before the age of 12. A child sent to a blacksmith, a cooper, or a miller lived under that roof, labored without wage, endured strict discipline, all in the hope that one day they might practice the craft themselves. For some, it was a path to independence. For most, it was simply a different kind of toil. Girls, especially, bore a quiet burden. By their early teens, many were seen as ready for marriage, not by choice but by custom. A girl of 14 might be wed to a man twice her age, chosen by her parents, blessed by the church, and expected to begin her own family before her body had finished growing. Childhood, for her, ended not with ceremony, but with childbirth. And motherhood was no easier than daughterhood. She nursed, worked, cooked, and hoped that her own infant might survive. Despite the hardship, children found moments of happiness. Not because they were free, but because the mind, especially when young, seeks joy wherever it can. A sunny day after rain, a stolen apple, the sound of music at a festival, the warmth of a shared blanket, laughter among siblings in the fading light of a long summer evening. These were not grand pleasures, but they were real, and they mattered. Older villagers often spoke of children as strong ones, marveling at how quickly they adapted, how they carried bundles without complaint, how they learned the rhythms of labor with silent understanding. But beneath that admiration was a truth. The child had no choice. There was no shelter from labor, no pause button on poverty, no sheltering arm that could keep the cold out, the work away. A child was born into a world already moving, already hungry, and they had to catch up or be left behind. There were no birthdays, no gifts. A name day might be remembered, a saint honored, but mostly the days passed in sameness. One day led to the next. A boy became a man when he could swing an axe without instruction. A girl became a woman when she bled and told no one, when she rose the next day and milked the cow without question. These transitions were not marked with parties. They were marked with labor. And so, while we speak today of childhood as protected time, a space of learning and dreaming, the peasant child knew only the narrow path between birth and work. Joy existed, but on the margins. Love was present, but often silent. And the soft years of life, those that today are watched so carefully, were, for them, simply the first steps in a long, hard journey. The medieval village was no sanctuary from illness. In fact, it was often the perfect host. Closed quarters, cold winters, poor nutrition, stagnant water, and no understanding of germs created a place where disease was not an occasional threat. It was a constant companion. It lingered in the corners of cottages. It drifted with the smoke from cooking fires. It moved in silence, invisible, inescapable. The peasant did not wonder if sickness would come. They simply waited to see when and to whom it would cling. The body was rarely in perfect health. Even on good days, most peasants carried pain, rheumatism in the joints, toothaches that never fully faded, skin infections, sores, chilblains, and lice were common and often untreated. The very water they drank, pulled from a stream or shallow well, might carry death. It was murky, shared with animals, warmed by the sun. There was no boiling, no filtering, and no understanding of contamination. When a child fell ill, the peasant mother might do what she could, a poultice of herbs, a whispered prayer, a spoon of warmed ale. But remedies were few, and most illnesses ran their course without intervention. Fever was feared. It meant the body had surrendered. It came with chills, sweat, mutterings. A person who once stood strong in the fields could be reduced in days to a husk of trembling limbs. Coughs deepened, bellies swelled, wounds festered. When the fever refused to break, there was little to be done. The sick were laid by the fire, covered in rough blankets, and watched. Family gathered quietly. There were no hospitals. The wealthiest might call a local physician, though this was more likely a man with books and ideas than actual cures. For the peasant, healing came, if at all, through chance, time, or the sheer will of the body. The plague, of course, loomed over the century like a shadow stretching across the map. Though outbreaks were not yearly when it arrived, it did so with speed and cruelty. The Black Death, especially, changed everything. Some villages were spared entirely. Others were emptied in weeks. Rats brought fleas, and the fleas brought death. A boil beneath the arm, a blackening of the skin, a delirium so complete that the dying laughed cried, and babbled like children. It was said that birds dropped dead mid-flight, that fields stood unharvested as bodies piled. In some places, there were too many corpses to bury, and carts rolled through the streets, collecting the dead like firewood. But even when plague did not rear its head, ordinary illness took its toll. Dysentery, cholera, tuberculosis, typhoid, influenza. Though names were not always known, the symptoms were loose bowels, vomiting, bloody sputum, weakness, pain. These were described in practical terms. A man with looseness, a woman with lung rot. There was no diagnosis, only observation, and no treatment, only waiting. Children were especially vulnerable. Many peasants could expect to bury half their offspring. It was not unusual for a woman to have 10 or 12 children and see only 4 reach adulthood. Infants died of fever, of cold, of unknown causes in the night. A baby that stopped suckling might be gone by morning. And the grief, though rarely shown, ran deep. Parents often avoided naming their children until they were sure the child would live. A child might be called boy or little one for months before baptism. It was not lack of love. It was defense. Against hope, the church offered some solace. Priests prayed over the sick, anointed them with oil, but even they were powerless. The presence of a priest at a bedside was not always a sign of healing. It was often the first step of death. The last rites, spoken in Latin, offer forgiveness, but not cure. The peasants accepted this. Illness was not seen as random. It was punishment, a test, a trial sent by God, perhaps for the sins of the individual, perhaps for the sins of the village. Either way, to question it was unthinkable. One bore the illness as one bore the winter, with quiet resignation. Healing came, sometimes through folk remedies. The village midwife might know a few herbs, yarrow, nettle, feverfew, boiled in water, chewed raw, or burned in the hearth to release their scent. Certain stones were thought to carry healing properties. A blue thread around the wrist might ward off illness. Garlic worn beneath the shirt. Ashes mixed with honey. These methods, half science, half superstition, were passed down mother to daughter, neighbor to neighbor. Sometimes they helped, sometimes they didn't. But to try something was better than nothing. When death came, and it often did, it was not dramatic. A slow breath, a stillness. The body washed by family hands, wrapped in cloth, carried to the churchyard, a hole dug by neighbors. A priest muttered prayers. Earth shoveled in silence. There were no gravestones, no records, just a name whispered once, then folded into memory. The land moved on. So did the living. The sick were not feared, not in the way we might think. There was little understanding of contagion. The dying were tended closely. Families sat nearby, held hands, fed broth from wooden spoons. Only in times of plague did fear outweigh duty. Then doors were shut, neighbors turned away. But even then it was not cruelty. It was terror. In the quiet weeks between illness, there was no celebration, only relief. The cough that faded, the child who stood again, the stomach that no longer cramped. These small victories were enough. And though no one said aloud, everyone watched, always, for the next fever. So disease remained like the wind to the thatch, unseen but always present. It shaped the rhythm of life, the choices made, the prayers spoken. It humbled the strong. It silenced the young. And through it all, the medieval peasant endured, not by mastering illness, but by surviving it. For the medieval peasant, food was not taken for granted. It was not a guarantee, nor a comfort always waiting at day's end. It was a question, a hope, a negotiation with the land, the weather, and fate itself. Each season brought the same calculation. Will this be enough? Will the harvest come? Will the store hold through winter? And even in good years, with full granaries and satisfied animals, hunger remained a close companion. Always just a week's rain or an early frost away. In this world, the body never forgot what it meant to be hungry. The diet was simple, monotonous, and ruled by necessity. Bread, coarse, dark, made from rye, barley, or oats, was the anchor of every meal. It was not the soft, yeasty loaf known today, but dense and heavy, filled with bits of husk and grit from a grinding stone. Each bite wore the teeth down. Flour was precious, and what little was milled by hand in village querns or at the Lord's mill came at a cost. Peasants paid to use the mill or surrendered a portion of what they ground. Sometimes, to stretch the flour, they added crushed beans or chestnut or even ground fern root, not for taste, but for volume. To this bread was added porridge or pottage, a kind of stew made from whatever could be found. Grains boiled in water, perhaps thickened with peas or lentils, a few chopped leeks or onions, wild garlic, if spring was generous, sometimes cabbage, or bits of herbs gathered from hedgerows. It was a grayish slurry, steaming in a clay pot, eaten with wooden spoons, shared among many. If meat was added, and that was rare, it was likely a scrap of bacon, a bit of bone from a chicken long since boiled twice. The taste came from hunger, not spice. Meat, in most homes, was a luxury. Hunting was restricted. Game belonged to the Lord. To poach was a crime, and if caught, the punishment could be brutal. A peasant might keep pigs or a few chickens, but these were assets. Eggs could be bartered. Piglets raised for future slaughter. To eat an animal was to lose future value. And so meat appeared mostly on feast days. A chicken on Easter, a shared piglet harvest, perhaps a few sausages dried by the hearth. Most of the year, the peasant's meat came in the form of bones boiled until the marrow surrendered, then dried for the dog. Fish, when available, was more common, especially during Lent when meat was forbidden. River fish like eel or perch were caught with hand nets or woven traps. But fishing, like so much else, often required permission from the Lord. Salted herring, preserved and bought in bulk, became a staple for those who could afford it. The taste was strong, the texture tough, but it filled the belly, and that was enough. Vegetables were grown in small garden plots, called toffs, behind the peasant's home. Turnips, parsnips, onions, leeks, and beans. These were hardy, grew in poor soil, and stored well. Peasants learned to dry or pickle what they could, burying root vegetables in sand or hanging herbs from the rafters. But these techniques were imperfect. A damp spring might rot the stores. A rodent might chew through sacks. Mold was ever present. And once the garden went bare in winter, there was no replenishment until spring. Fruit was seasonal and often wild: blackberries, crab apples, sloes. These were foraged, not cultivated. When summer was generous, the village shared in its sweetness. When it was not, the trees bore nothing, and no one could force them to. Dairy, milk, cheese, butter was part of the diet, but limited. A cow was wealth. A goat, more likely. Milk was consumed quickly before it spoiled. Butter, when churned, might be saved in cool cellars or salt-packed crocks. Cheese, hard and tangy, stored longer. But yields were small. A family with 6 children, a mother and father, and one milking goat could not stretch the supply far. Children received what was available. Infants were weaned early. The idea of overfeeding was laughable. Most stomachs rumbled by evening. Seasonality dictated everything. Spring brought greens, young nettles, dandelion leaves, shoots from a hedgerow. Summer brought hope. Autumn, the harvest. Winter, fear. The lean months, between January and March, were dreaded. Stores grew low. Rats found the granary. Cold, slow digestion. Burned energy. Work continued, but food did not. It was in these months that villagers thinned. Eyes hollowed. Children coughed. Old men died. The harvest itself was a drama. A single bad harvest meant a hard winter. 2 in a row could mean starvation. Drought, hail, flood, or disease could ruin months of labor. Peasants watched the sky like priests. A clear day brought hope. A clouded morning, dread. And once the crops were in, the tithe had to be paid. A tenth to the church, a portion to the Lord. What remained went to the family, or was sold at market for necessities. The best grain was often surrendered. The rest kept for porridge, feed, or seed. Famine was not abstract. It came in cycles. Not every decade, but often enough to live in memory. Villagers remembered the year of black rye, when mold made the bread sour and dangerous. They remembered the green winter, when no snow came and the wheat failed. In famine years, Bark was stripped from trees. Grass boiled to mush. Dogs disappeared. Hunger was not dramatic, but slow. Strength faded. Joints ached. The mind dulled. And worst of all, the hunger became normal. The body stopped fighting. Despite all this, food was respected, even sacred. A crumb dropped was picked up. A crust of bread, kissed. The family ate together, in silence or quiet conversation. There were no courses, no table settings. Just a shared bowl, a single loaf, hands reaching, a spoon passed. And even when the pot was near empty, there was sharing. A neighbor might receive a slice. A widow, a handful of beans. Not because there was plenty, but because all understood what it meant to have none. Feasting, when it came, was overwhelming. A wedding, a festival, a good harvest. Ale flowed, meat roasted. Children laughed. Bellies swelled. For one night, the fear loosened its grip. But even then, the peasant knew. Tomorrow, the pottage would return. The bread would grow thin. And hunger would sit again by the fire. Food, then, was not just sustenance. It was a measure of time, of success, of community. It dictated moods, births, deaths, marriages. It was currency, medicine, faith. And in the end, it was always uncertain. In the world of the medieval peasant, time did not tick by on a clock. It moved with the rhythm of the earth, the arc of the sun, the deep churn of the seasons. There were no calendars in cottages, no clocks on the wall, no days off marked in ink. Time was marked by what the body did, when it rose, when it toiled, when it rested. And that rhythm was ruled, without mercy or pause, by the changing face of nature. Spring, summer, autumn, winter, each one brought demands, and each one left marks on both body and soul. Spring was the season of hope and of hunger. The days grew longer. Light returned, and with it, the first green shoots pushed through cold soil. But food was often at its lowest. The stores were nearly gone. The dried beans and withered turnips that had lasted through the cold were growing mold. There might still be salted fish, hardened bread, a sack of oats, but not much. And so, spring was labor, planting, tending, digging, clearing, all done on an empty stomach. Yet, the spirit of renewal ran quietly beneath the hardship. Trees budded. Lambs were born. The smell of damp earth brought with it a kind of invisible strength, the deep knowledge that life was returning, even if slowly. Summer came with light, heat, and endless work. Days stretched toward 14 hours of sun, and nearly every hour was used. Peasants rose before dawn and worked past dusk, weeding, scything, watching over animals, carrying water to thirsty fields. The heat was no excuse. Sweat dripped. Skin burned and cracked. Children ran barefoot through dust that stuck to their legs like paint. And while food was more available, with early vegetables, eggs, and milk, the body burned it quickly. Yet, summer also brought brief joys. Wild berries, warm nights, the rare swim in a pond, a dance in the village green. But these pleasures were momentary, like breezes. Most of summer was labor. Autumn, the harvest season, was everything. It was a moment toward which the entire year bent. The grain ripened. The fruits hung heavy. The vegetables, plump and ready, demanded attention. And the window was short. A week too late, and rains would ruin the wheat. A day's delay could mean rot in the apples. Entire families, from the eldest grandfather to the smallest child, worked side by side. Sickles flashed in the fields. Baskets filled. Wagons groaned. And at night, bodies fell into sleep so deep it felt like stone. There was no margin for error. Everything depended on what could be gathered, dried, stored. The winter loomed just beyond the hedgerow. But autumn also brought celebration. The harvest feast, simple, yes, but joyous. A roasted pig, ale from the last batch, bread still warm. The church bells rang. Songs were sung. And for a few brief nights, the peasant felt rich. Yet, even in those moments, there was calculation. How many sacks of barley? Will the oats keep? Will the root cellar stay dry this year? And then came winter, quiet, long, punishing. The fields went bare. The animals huddled. The earth, once alive and moving, hardened beneath frost and snow. Days shortened. The light came late and left early. Fires were lit at dawn, fed slowly with dwindling wood. The body stiffened. Fingers lost their nimbleness. Joints ached, and the hunger returned. Rations were watched carefully. A turnip here, a hunk of cheese there. Meals grew smaller. The stomach shrank. The body grew slower, colder. Yet winter was not only about survival. It was also a time of reflection and closeness. Families gathered indoors. Stories were told. Tools were repaired. Wool was spun. And despite the cold, there was comfort in the closeness. A crowded cottage meant shared warmth. Songs were sung softly in the evenings. Children played with shadows on the wall. There was a rhythm, even in the stillness. The seasons did not just shape what the peasant did. They shaped who the peasant was. People spoke of a spring child, born with luck and green eyes, or of someone with a summer soul, quick to laugh. The seasons were not background, they were alive, characters in every life. Each year was a wheel turning. There was no beginning, no end, just a return. The soul followed the cycle. In spring, there was repentance and hope. Lent demanded fasts and prayers. In summer, the festivals of saints brought color and song. In autumn, All Saints' Day reminded peasant of the dead. In winter, Christmas brought solemnity and a rare celebration of light and darkness. The church taught that each season echoed divine truth. Life, death, resurrection, all seen in the sowing and reaping of grain. Illness, too, followed the weather. Coughs in winter, fevers in summer, death in spring, when weak bodies failed to greet the new growth. Every old villager had stories. The bad harvest of 47, the frozen year when the river stopped, the lightning storm that set the thatch ablaze. The seasons held memory, held warning, and the body kept score. A shoulder injured during harvest never quite healed. A frostbite on the toes at 12 still stung at 20. Children learned early to fear the cold, to bless the rain, to look skyward for answers. Life taught patience. It taught humility. No one controlled the sun or snow. Not the reeve, not the priest, not even the Lord. So the peasant adapted, grew inward in winter, stretched outward in summer, held breath in spring, exhaled in autumn. It was a life not against nature, but with it. Even when cruel, the earth fed and punished in equal measure. And the peasant, knowing this, neither cursed nor praised too loudly. They simply rose each day and endured what the season offered. The wheel turned, and the peasant turned with it. And so, when we look back upon the life of the medieval peasant, we must set aside the noise of modern comforts and listen carefully to the hush that filled their world. No fame adorned their names. No monuments bore their likenesses. No long poems were written in their honor. Yet they endured, quietly, invisibly, and completely. Their lives were not measured in achievements, but in the sheer act of continuing, of waking each day, lacing cracked hands to the same tasks, breathing air heavy with wood smoke and soil, and walking the same muddy paths until the end. Endurance was not taught to the peasant. It was not a lesson delivered by priest or lord. It was absorbed, almost by osmosis, from a moment of birth. A baby wrapped in rough linen, cradled beside the fire, knew only the smell of labor and the rhythm of want. The first thing learned was patience. The second, silence. And by the time a child could walk, they understood, not in words, but in feeling, that life was hard and would remain so. And still, they walked forward. A peasant did not ask for justice. They knew it belonged elsewhere. Nor did they expect comfort. Only moments of warmth, a slice of bread, a shared glance near the fire. Their expectations were low, but their spirit was not broken. They did not need much to be content. A good harvest, a healthy child, a winter less cold than the last. These were their triumphs, quiet and invisible as they were. To endure was to accept without surrender. The peasant did not rebel every day, though many dreamed of it in the still hours of the night. Some surely cursed the Lord beneath their breath, or looked to the forest and thought of running. But most stayed, because they had to, because family, village, faith, and hunger bound them tighter than chains. and because they knew somehow that their existence, uncelebrated, unglamorous, kept the entire world spinning. The peasant built the roads, raised the walls, plowed the fields, and baked the bread. Their labor, unseen by history, fed the lords and kings and priests. Their taxes paid for cathedrals they never saw. Their sweat lined the stones of castles they were forbidden to enter. Their prayers filled the churches. Their names filled the burial grounds. And still they endured. They were not empty of feeling. They laughed, not loudly, perhaps, but often. They fell in love. They danced, even when their feet ached from the fields. They carved toys for their children. They whispered stories by candlelight. They mourned their dead with tears, even if those tears were quickly dried by wind and obligation. They found meaning in small things. A bird singing on the thatch, a piglet born healthy, a patch of wheat growing taller than expected. These were their joys. They shared what they had. A bowl of pottage for a sick neighbor. An old cloak patched and given to a widow. A candle burned for someone lost. Generosity in the face of scarcity. Kindness with nothing to spare. These were the invisible threads that bound the village. Not wealth, not power. Just the daily act of looking at another and saying, I see you. I know your struggle. Here is what I can give. And when the end came, it came quietly. A cough that deepened. A wound that would not heal. A winter too harsh. A child who stopped waking. Death was not a stranger. It walked beside them always, and they made peace with it in their own way. There were no long goodbyes. No promises of legacy. Just the knowledge that the field would still need tending. The animals feeding. Life would go on, and that was enough. Burial was simple. A shroud. A prayer. Earth turned by callous hands. A name spoken once, maybe twice. And then the world continued, not out of disrespect, but necessity. Grief had to move quickly. The living needed food. The children needed tending. And the dead would not want waste. No record marked their passing. No monument rose. But the earth remembered. The field once plowed still yielded wheat. The wall they mended still stood. The son they raised still tended sheep. The daughter they taught still spun wool. And in these small, enduring acts, the peasant lived on. So when you picture medieval village, mist rising over damp fields, smoke curling from low chimneys, chickens scratching the dirt, remember them, not as shadows, not as background, but as the heart of it all. Quiet hands, bare feet, bent backs, eyes that saw everything. Though they said little, they had no rights. They had little food, but they had each other. They had the land. And above all, they had the will to wake each day and begin again. That was their power. That was their dignity. And that is why, even in silence, they matter